The nails were still warm from his hands when the letter finally came back. 3 words that would change everything. I accept, Nathaniel. For 3 years, Nathaniel Cross had built a house for a woman who did not yet exist in his life, hammering hope into every board on a windswept stretch of Montana prairie. And when her answer finally arrived, he sat alone at his kitchen table and wept like a man who had been given back something he thought he'd lost forever. The year was 1887, and the town of Larkspur Hollow, Montana, was little more than a scattering of clapboard buildings clinging to the edge of a vast, indifferent sky. Nathaniel Cross had come west at 19 with his father's pocket watch, his mother's Bible, and a debt of grief so heavy it had pressed him flat against the earth for years. His parents had died within a single winter. His father of a fever that swept through their Ohio township. His mother of what the doctor called consumption, but what Nathaniel privately believed was simply a broken heart that refused to keep beating without her husband beside it. He had buried them both before his 20th birthday, and something in him had gone quiet ever since, like a bell that had been rung once, hard, and never rung again. He bought land with the last of his father's savings, sight unseen, on the promise of a railroad agent who spoke of Montana the way preachers spoke of heaven. When he arrived, he found not Eden but emptiness. 300 acres of tall grass, 1 crooked cottonwood tree, and silence so complete it rang in his ears at night. He built a soddy first, a low house dug into the earth because a soddy was fast and cheap and kept a man alive through his first brutal winter. He told himself he would build something better when he had reason to. For years, he found no reason. He worked the land alone, raised cattle, learned to mend his own boots and cook his own bread, and became, without quite noticing it, the kind of man that neighbors described as decent but distant, a man who tipped his hat at church and disappeared before anyone could ask him to supper. It was his neighbor, a weathered widow named Ruth Callahan who ran the mercantile with her son, who finally said the thing nobody else had the nerve to say. She told him plainly, over a counter stacked with flour sacks, that a man could not farm loneliness and expect it to yield anything but more of the same. She had seen the way his eyes lingered on families at the church picnic, the way his jaw tightened when children ran past him laughing. She told him about a newspaper published back east that carried advertisements from women seeking husbands on the frontier, women who had lost fathers to war, brothers to disease, prospects to poverty, and who wanted nothing more than a fair chance at a life. Nathaniel had laughed the idea off at first, calling it foolishness, ordering a wife the way a man orders a plow blade from a catalog. But that night, alone in his soddy with the wind pressing against the walls like a living thing, he found himself staring at the low dirt ceiling and thinking that foolishness might be exactly what his life required. He did not write to any newspaper that year or the next. Instead, he did something stranger and more stubborn. He began to build. If he was ever going to ask a woman to cross a continent and bind her life to a stranger's, he decided she would not step into a hole in the ground. She would step into a home. He spent that first winter drawing plans on the backs of feed sacks by lamplight, studying the framing of the church and the parson's house, asking the traveling carpenter who came through town each spring more questions than the man had patience for. He saved every dollar his cattle brought in instead of expanding his herd. He drove 11 miles to the sawmill in Cedarville twice a month, hauling lumber back over rutted roads, his wagon groaning under the weight of boards meant for a woman he had not yet met. The building took him nearly 3 years, worked into the margins of a rancher's brutal calendar. Evenings after the herd was fed, Sundays after church, the short gray days of winter when the ground was too frozen to work but his hands still ached to build something. He raised the frame himself, board by board, cursing when he smashed his thumb, laughing alone sometimes at the absurdity of a grown man building a house for a ghost. He put in 2 bedrooms, though he told himself the second was simply practical. He built a porch that faced east, so that whoever stood on it would watch the sun rise over the wheat fields rather than set behind them, because he had decided, in some private unspoken way, that this house was not for endings but for beginnings. He framed windows wider than necessary because Ruth Callahan had once mentioned, in passing, that a woman likes a house with light in it. He did not know why he remembered that detail so precisely, except that some part of him had already begun building for a person he could picture only in outline, dark-eyed or pale, soft-spoken or sharp-tongued. He did not know, but real, someday, somehow real. By the spring of 1890, the house stood finished on the rise above the creek, whitewashed, sturdy. With a stone chimney his neighbor's son had helped him lay and a hand-carved front door Nathaniel had made from a fallen oak. Townsfolk began to talk. Some admired him for his patience. Others whispered that a man who built so carefully for a wife he didn't have must be either the most romantic fool in the territory or the loneliest. Nathaniel heard both opinions and privately agreed with each. He walked through the empty room some evenings just to hear his own footsteps echo, and it was on one of those evenings, standing in the kitchen he had built with a window over the sink so a woman could watch the fields while she worked, that he finally sat down and wrote the letter that would change his life. He wrote to a matrimonial newspaper based in St. Louis, one Ruth had recommended after making some inquiries of her own. He did not write anything embellished or grand. He described himself honestly. 31 years old, a rancher, a man of quiet habits and steady work, a widower's son who understood grief and did not expect a stranger to fill it, but who hoped, humbly, that companionship might be built the same way a house was built. One plank at a time, with patience, with care, with a willingness to keep going even when the work was hard. He mentioned the house last, almost like a confession, admitting that he had built it 3 years before he ever placed this advertisement, because he could not bear the thought of asking a woman to share a life with him in a place unworthy of her. He signed the letter and mailed it before he could talk himself out of it, and then he waited the way a man waits for weather to break, helplessly and with his whole chest. 2 months passed with no answer, and Nathaniel told himself he had been foolish to expect one, that no woman with sense would cross the country for a stranger's house and a stranger's silence. But in the 3rd month, a letter arrived from Charleston, South Carolina, in handwriting so careful it looked almost frightened of the page, and it was signed by a woman named Charlotte Bennett. Charlotte's letter told a story of its own. One Nathaniel would read so many times over the following weeks that the paper began to soften at its folds. She wrote that her father, a schoolteacher, had died 2 years prior, and that her mother had followed him into the ground the following winter, leaving Charlotte at 26 without family, without a dowry, and without the kind of prospects a respectable unmarried woman was supposed to have secured years before. She had been living with an aunt who made her gratitude for shelter feel like a debt collected daily in small cruelties. Reminders of her plainness, her age, her lack of a husband, delivered over breakfast like seasoning on eggs. Charlotte wrote plainly that she did not expect romance, that she had buried enough people to know love was not owed to anyone, but that she wanted, desperately, a life that was hers. A kitchen she did not have to ask permission to use, a door she could close, a chance to matter to someone the way a person matters when they are chosen rather than tolerated. She said Nathaniel's letter had struck her because he had not promised her love or beauty or ease. He had promised a house, built with his own hands, and something about that honesty had undone her more than any flowery proposal could have. She asked if he was willing, whether he might have her. Nathaniel wrote back the same evening. He did not sleep that night, and when he finally did, he dreamed of the house filled with light and the sound of someone else's footsteps on the stairs he had built. Letters passed between Montana and South Carolina for 4 more months, each one a small excavation, the two of them digging carefully toward each other across 2,000 miles of unfamiliar ground. Charlotte asked about winters, about the nearest church, about whether he read, and he told her the truth every time, that winters were long and hard, that the church was small but kind, that he read his father's Bible and little else but wanted, if she was willing to teach him, to read more. He asked about her father's classroom, about the books she loved, about whether she believed a person could build a new life the way a man builds a house, plank by plank, even after loss had knocked the first one down. She wrote back that she believed it because she had no choice left but to believe it, and that belief, however thin, was still a kind of faith. In the autumn of 1890, Charlotte Bennett boarded a train in Charleston with a single trunk containing her mother's quilt, her father's collection of poetry, 3 dresses, and a Bible with her family's names written in the front in her mother's hand. The journey took the better part of a week, changing trains twice, crossing landscapes she had never imagined. The flat, endless fields of Kansas, the rising foothills of the Rockies, the vast Montana sky that seemed, even through a dusty train window, too large for any single person to survive beneath. She wrote in a small diary during the journey, entries Nathaniel would not read until years later, and in them she confessed a terror so deep it made her hands shake on the page. A fear that she was trading one kind of loneliness for another, that a stranger's honesty in letters might not survive the harder honesty of a shared life, that she was, in the end, simply a desperate woman gambling the last of herself on a man she had never seen. Nathaniel drove the wagon to the train depot in Cedarville on the appointed day wearing his father's good coat, brushed twice, his boots polished with tallow until they shone, his hands scrubbed raw from nervous washing. He arrived 2 hours early and paced the platform until the stationmaster began to give him curious looks. When the train finally came into view, a distant smudge of smoke against the pale autumn sky, Nathaniel felt something in his chest seize up entirely, a fear so large it nearly sent him back to the wagon before the train had even stopped. He thought of every version of disappointment that might be waiting for him, A woman who took one look at his weathered hands and rough manners and regretted the whole arrangement. A woman whose kindness in letters had been performance rather than truth. He almost turned away. But then the train hissed to a stop, and passengers began to step down onto the platform. And among them, in a gray traveling dress with her father's poetry book clutched against her chest like armor, stood a woman with dark hair coming loose from its pins and eyes that scanned the platform with the particular desperation of someone who has traveled too far to turn back and is terrified of what waits at the end of the road. Their eyes met, and for a long moment neither of them moved, as though the entire journey, his 3 years of building, her 2 years of grief, the months of careful letters, had led only to this single suspended breath on a dusty platform in Cedarville, Montana. Nathaniel removed his hat, which he would later admit he had rehearsed doing at least a dozen times in the wagon, and said her name the way a man says a prayer he isn't sure will be answered. Charlotte's chin trembled, and she said his name back, and something in the sound of it, her voice, real and present and no longer confined to paper, seemed to settle something in both of them that words alone had not been able to reach. The drive back to the ranch took nearly 2 hours, and Nathaniel would remember it later as one of the strangest, most tender stretches of silence he had ever sat inside. Charlotte asked small questions, about the mountains in the distance, about a hawk circling overhead, about whether the cattle grazing the hillsides belonged to him, and he answered each one carefully, aware of how much rode on every word, how a woman deciding whether she had made a terrible mistake might be listening for any sign of cruelty or coldness in him. He found, to his own surprise, that talking to her felt less like performance than his months of forced pleasantries at church socials ever had. Something about her attention, quiet and searching, made him want to tell the truth rather than manage an impression. When the wagon finally crested the rise above the creek and the house came into view, whitewashed boards catching the late afternoon light, smoke curling from the chimney where Ruth Callahan had kindly lit a fire that morning in preparation, the wide porch facing east exactly as he had planned, Nathaniel felt his throat close entirely. He had imagined this moment for 3 years, and now that it had arrived, he found he could not speak at all. Charlotte, beside him, had gone very still. She had expected, she would later confess, a soddy or a shack, the kind of rough frontier dwelling that matrimonial newspapers rarely bothered to describe honestly. She had prepared herself on the long train ride west for disappointment as a simple fact of her new life, one more loss to absorb quietly the way she had learned to absorb all the others. But the house rising before her in the autumn light was nothing like the meager shelter she had steeled herself for. It was solid and square and unmistakably built with care. She could see it in the evenness of the porch boards, the careful trim around the windows, the front door with its hand-carved detailing that no man builds unless he is thinking, with every stroke of the chisel, of someone he hopes to please. Nathaniel helped her down from the wagon, and she stood for a long moment simply looking at the house, and then at him and then back at the house as though trying to reconcile the plain, quiet, sun-weathered rancher beside her with the evident tenderness of what he had built. She asked him, her voice unsteady, when he had built it, and when he told her, 3 years before he had ever written his advertisement, that he had built it not knowing who would come, only hoping that someone would. Charlotte Bennett, who had buried both her parents without shedding a single tear in front of her aunt because she had learned that tears were a luxury the grieving could not afford, began to cry on the porch of a house built by a stranger who had somehow, impossibly, been waiting for her before he even knew her name. She walked through the front door that evening and stopped in the front room, turning slowly, taking in the stone hearth, the wide windows catching the last gold light of the day, the 2 rocking chairs he had built and placed before the fire though he had only ever sat in one. She walked into the kitchen and found the window over the sink, precisely where a woman would want to stand and watch the fields while she worked, and she pressed her hand flat against the sill as though checking that it was real. She climbed the stairs he had cut and fitted himself and found the second bedroom, empty, waiting, built on nothing but hope. And when she came back down and found Nathaniel standing awkwardly by the door, still holding her trunk, uncertain whether he had done something wonderful or something that would frighten her entirely, Charlotte Bennett said the words that Nathaniel would carry in his chest for the rest of his life. "This doesn't feel like a stranger's house," she told him. "Feels like home. I don't know how you built a home for someone you'd never met, but you did, and I am standing in it." The first months of their marriage were not without difficulty, and it would dishonor the truth of their story to pretend otherwise. Charlotte had grown up in a city, the daughter of a schoolteacher, accustomed to paved streets and church bells marking the hours and neighbors close enough to call across a fence. Montana's isolation pressed on her in ways she had not anticipated. The nearest neighbor woman a 4-mile ride away, winters that arrived in October and did not release their grip until April, the particular loneliness of a landscape so vast it seemed to swallow a person whole. There were nights that first winter when she sat by the fire Nathaniel had built and wept quietly for the sound of her mother's voice, for the church bells of Charleston, for a version of her life that had died along with her parents and that she now understood, with a grief that surprised her in its freshness, she would never have back. Nathaniel, for his part, struggled with the opposite difficulty. A man who had spent a decade learning to need no one, learning to armor himself against disappointment by expecting nothing, now faced with a wife whose sorrow he did not know how to comfort, whose silences he could not always read, whose presence in his house was a joy so large it frightened him, because joy that large felt like something that could be taken away. There was a particular night in that first January, when a blizzard sealed the ranch off from the rest of the world for 4 days straight, that nearly broke something between them before it had properly begun. Charlotte, half mad with cabin fever and grief and the terror of a storm she had never seen the likes of, had said something sharp to Nathaniel about the foolishness of building a house for a woman he had never met, about whether he had truly wanted her or simply wanted someone, anyone, to fill the rooms he had built. The words had cut him more deeply than she perhaps intended, and Nathaniel, who had spent his whole adult life avoiding exactly this kind of confrontation, very nearly retreated into the silence that had protected him for a decade. He had gone out to the barn despite the storm, ostensibly to check on the cattle, and had stood there in the frozen dark for the better part of an hour, wrestling with the old familiar instinct to simply close himself off again, to decide that this had been a mistake and to spend the rest of his life quietly, safely alone. But when he came back inside, half frozen, he found Charlotte sitting at the kitchen table with her father's poetry book open in front of her, not reading it, just holding it the way a person holds something for comfort rather than use. And instead of retreating to his chair by the fire the way the old Nathaniel would have, he sat down across from her and told her, haltingly, in the plainest words he owned, that he had not built the house for a woman, any woman. He had built it because building it was the only way he knew how to keep believing that his life was not simply going to be an accumulation of loss, that something good might still be waiting for him if he kept his hands busy and his hope alive long enough. He told her that when her letter came, he had wept at the kitchen table because for the first time in a decade, hope had actually been rewarded, and that the fear underneath his silence these past weeks was not indifference but terror, the terror of a man who has finally been given something precious and does not trust himself not to lose it. Charlotte listened to all of this with tears sliding down her face, and when he finished, she reached across the table and took his rough, chapped hand in both of hers, and told him that she was afraid too, that her sharp words had been grief wearing anger's clothing, and that she did not want a version of this marriage where either of them managed their pain alone in separate rooms of a house built for two. That night marked something of a turning point, though it would be dishonest to describe it as the resolution of every difficulty. Marriages, like houses, are not built in a single season, and theirs continued to be built slowly, board by board, through the ordinary accumulation of shared days. Charlotte teaching Nathaniel to read beyond his father's Bible, starting with her own father's poetry. The two of them sounding out unfamiliar words together by lamplight until Nathaniel, a grown man of 32, found himself moved to tears by a Wordsworth poem in a way he never expected to be moved by anything again. Nathaniel teaching Charlotte to ride, to recognize weather in the color of the sky, to find a strange, hard-won peace in the vastness of land that had once terrified her, until she came to love the very emptiness she had once feared, understanding it not as absence but as a kind of room large enough to hold whatever grief or joy a person needed to set down inside it. Spring came, and with it the first green shoots across the fields. Nathaniel had worked alone for a decade, and Charlotte found herself standing on the east-facing porch some mornings simply to watch the sunrise the way her husband had, unknowingly, built the house to allow. She began keeping bees along the fence line, an old skill from her mother she had never expected to use again. She started a small garden by the kitchen window, so that when she stood at the sink and looked out, as Nathaniel had once imagined a woman doing, she saw not empty prairie but rows of beans and squash she had planted herself, a landscape she had made her own. Ruth Callahan, who had first suggested the matrimonial advertisement out of simple neighborly concern, became Charlotte's closest friend in Larkspur Hollow, and it was Ruth who told Charlotte, one afternoon over the mercantile counter, about the years Nathaniel had spent building before he ever wrote a single word to a newspaper, about the 11-mile lumber hauls, the smashed thumbs, the townsfolk who had called him foolish or worse. Charlotte had known some of this already, from Nathaniel's own halting confession, but hearing it confirmed by a neighbor who had watched it happen with her own eyes struck her freshly, and she found herself crying again, this time not from grief but from something that felt dangerously, wonderfully close to gratitude. By the time their first child was born, in the autumn of 1891, almost exactly 1 year after Charlotte had stepped off the train in Cedarville, the house on the rise above the creek had become something neither of them could have described in a matrimonial advertisement or a careful letter. It had become, simply and completely, a home. Not because of the boards Nathaniel had cut or the windows he had framed wide for light, though those things mattered, but because two people who had each been nearly hollowed out by loss had chosen, deliberately and repeatedly, to build something together rather than survive alone. They named their daughter Eleanor after Charlotte's mother, and Nathaniel built her cradle himself from the same oak he had used for the front door, so that the same hands that had built a house for a stranger now built a bed for a daughter neither of them could have imagined possible in the darker years before. There is a particular photograph, taken some years later by a traveling photographer who passed through Larkspur Hollow, that shows Nathaniel and Charlotte Cross standing on the porch of that house with 3 children arranged around them, Charlotte's hand resting on Nathaniel's arm, both of them squinting slightly into the Montana sun.